What happens when a royal title becomes a burden, and a prince chooses to walk with the oppressed instead of ruling them? This is the haunting story of Archduke Wilhelm of Austria, who became Ukraine's most unlikely patriot. Historical context and early life, 1895 to 1914. The late 19th century in Europe was an era of precarious splendor, where the Austro-Hungarian Empire stretched like a vast mosaic across Central and Eastern Europe, uniting diverse nationalities under the Habsburg crown. Emperors such as Franz Joseph navigated a delicate balance between monarchical tradition and surging nationalist sentiments, as Poles, Hungarians, Czechs, and others demanded greater autonomy amid industrialization and social reforms. This period saw the empire grappling with internal fractures, where ethnic identities were both suppressed and strategically manipulated to preserve unity. The Habsburgs, as rulers, often assigned family members to foster loyalties among specific groups, turning personal affiliations into tools of imperial stability. In this intricate web of alliances and tensions, young nobles were raised with a sense of predestined duty, their educations blending classical learning, military training, and diplomatic maneuvering to prepare them for roles that could span from court intrigue to battlefield command. Wilhelm entered this world on February 10, 1895, on the family estate on the sunny island of Lochinj in the Adriatic Sea, part of the empire's Austrian littoral, now in Croatia, though some records note his birth in the nearby naval port of Pola, reflecting the family's deep ties to maritime life. As the youngest of 6 children born to Archduke Karl Stephan, a distinguished naval admiral whose career in the Austrian Navy spanned decades, and who harbored grand ambitions for a restored Polish kingdom under Habsburg rule, and Archduchess Maria Theresia, a princess of Tuscany, whose lineage brought a touch of Italian vitality and artistic flair to the household. Wilhelm's early years blended adventure and rigid protocol in ways that shaped his worldview profoundly. The family dynamics were vibrant yet hierarchical, with Karl Stephan's stern naval discipline contrasting Maria Theresia's warmer, more nurturing influence, drawn from her Tuscan roots where Renaissance humanism lingered in family traditions. Wilhelm's siblings included older brothers like Archduke Karl Albrecht and Archduke Leo Karl, who would later align closely with their father's Polish aspirations, becoming officers in Polish forces and marrying into Polish nobility, as well as sisters Renata, Mechtildes, and Eleanor, whose marriages further cemented family ties to European aristocracy. Growing up as the baby of the family, Wilhelm often found himself in the shadow of his more assertive siblings, which may have fostered a quiet introspection and a tendency to seek out paths less trodden. The family's lifestyle was nomadic at first, centered around Karl Stephan's naval postings. They resided in Pola until 1898, where the young Wilhelm was exposed to the bustling harbor life, the salty sea air, and the multicultural mix of sailors from across the empire, Italians, Croats, and Slovenes, mingling in a microcosm of Habsburg diversity. This early exposure to varied cultures likely planted seeds of curiosity about ethnic identities beyond the elite circles. Summers were spent sailing yachts across the Mediterranean, visiting royal relatives from the Spanish Bourbons to Italian Savoyards, fostering a cosmopolitan outlook that made Wilhelm fluent in multiple languages from a tender age, including German, Italian, French, and English, skills that would later prove invaluable in his diplomatic and military endeavors. These voyages were not mere leisure, they were educational, with tutors aboard teaching history, geography, and etiquette, instilling in Wilhelm a sense of the empire's vastness and fragility. Yet, beneath the glamour, there were undercurrents of family expectation. Karl Stefan's relentless push for Polish revival meant Polish language lessons and cultural immersion were mandatory, even as the children absorbed broader European influences. By 1906, the family settled more permanently in Saybush, now Żywiec in Poland, a sprawling Galician estate that became the heart of their Polish-oriented life. This move marked a shift from seaside adventures to the rolling hills and forests of Galicia, a region rife with ethnic tensions between Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews. The estate was a miniature kingdom, complete with breweries, famous for the Żywiec beer that the family owned, and grand hunts, where Wilhelm learned horsemanship and marksmanship, essential for a future military career. Karl Stefan embraced Polish identity fully, speaking the language at home, hosting Polish intellectuals and nobles, and arranging marriages for his daughters to prominent Polish families like the Czartoryskis and Radziwiłłs. He positioned himself as a potential regent for an independent Poland, a dream fueled by the empire's weakening grip and rising nationalist movements. In this environment, Ukrainians of Galicia, then often referred to as Ruthenians, were viewed by Karl Stefan and his circle as unruly peasants, potential threats to Polish dominance, their Highland customs dismissed as backward, and their aspirations for autonomy seen as disruptive to the social order. Young Wilhelm absorbed these narratives during family dinners and estate gatherings, where discussions of politics and ethnicity were commonplace, but they ignited curiosity rather than contempt. His father's unyielding Polish patriotism clashed with Wilhelm's emerging independence, a subtle rebellion that began to manifest in his teens. Perhaps influenced by the diverse sailors of his early years or the estate's Ukrainian servants, Wilhelm questioned the hierarchies he was taught. At age 17 in 1912, he acted on this curiosity, traveling anonymously to Hutzul villages in the Carpathian Mountains, such as Warachta and Żabie, now Verkhovina, under an assumed name to avoid drawing attention as a Habsburg. This journey was no mere escapade. It involved boarding rustic trains, hiking remote paths, and staying with local families in simple wooden huts adorned with intricate carvings. He immersed himself in their daily lives, learning traditional songs that echoed tales of Cossack heroes and mountain freedoms, mastering dances like the kolomika with its energetic steps and spins, and absorbing stories passed down through generations about struggles against oppression. He tasted homemade moonshine distilled from local grains, shared meals of borscht and vareniki around communal fires, and participated in festivals where embroidered costumes and folk music filled the air with a sense of communal joy and resilience. Far from finding the wild bandits his family described, he discovered a vibrant, resilient people with a rich cultural heritage deserving of respect and autonomy, their Greek Catholic faith blending Byzantine rituals with local customs, their embroidery patterns symbolizing ancient protections against evil. This experience was a profound awakening, almost spiritual in its intensity, reshaping his identity from a detached aristocrat to someone who felt a kinship with the underprivileged. Wilhelm began to see Ukrainians not as subordinates, but as a nation without a state, worthy of leadership and self-determination. Their language, a melodic Slavic tongue with unique inflections, becoming a secret passion he studied in private. He collected Ukrainian books and artifacts, hiding them from his father's disapproving gaze, and even composed early notes on their folklore, foreshadowing his later poetry. This shift revealed deeper psychological layers. A young man rebelling against paternal authority, finding in the Ukrainians' marginalization a mirror to his own feelings of being the overlooked youngest son, driven by an innate empathy that contrasted the empire's exploitative structures. His family, initially shocked by his affinity for what they deemed inferior peasants, earning him whispers of being the Red Prince for his perceived socialist leanings toward the poor, eventually recognized its strategic value. The pragmatic Habsburgs, always keen on leveraging family members for political gain, encouraged his interest, providing tutors in Ukrainian history and language, training him as a cultural bridge to Ukrainian subjects, akin to his father's role among Poles. Emperor Franz Joseph himself may have seen potential in this as the empire sought to counter Russian influence in Slavic regions by promoting loyalist nationalisms. However, Wilhelm's passion transcended politics. It was deeply personal, rooted in empathy for the marginalized, a genuine emotional connection that made him question the moral foundations of imperial rule. This early divergence set the stage for lifelong conflicts with his family and empire, as he grappled with the contradictions of being a prince advocating for the oppressed, his internal struggles manifesting in a quiet determination that would propel him into the tumults of war and revolution. These formative years, blending privilege with awakening, laid the groundwork for a life where personal conviction clashed repeatedly with geopolitical realities, highlighting the human capacity for transformation amid rigid societal structures. As Wilhelm matured, this foundation would influence his military choices, leading him to units where he could champion Ukrainian causes. But for now, in the pre-war calm, it simmered as a private fire, fueling a destiny far from the throne his bloodline promised. World War I and military service, 1914 to 1918. The eruption of World War I in 1914 crystallized Wilhelm's path, thrusting him into a conflict that would dismantle empires and ignite national revolutions across Europe, reshaping the continent's map and awakening long-dormant ethnic aspirations. At the age of 19, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand sending shockwaves through Vienna, Wilhelm found himself at a crossroads, his youthful curiosity about Ukrainian culture now intersecting with the harsh demands of total war. He enrolled in Vienna's prestigious War College, an institution renowned for training the empire's elite officers in strategy, tactics, and leadership, where rigorous drills and theoretical studies honed his skills amid the urgency of mobilization. Graduating in 1915 at just 20 years old, he was commissioned as a lieutenant and immediately assigned to the front lines with the 13th Galicia Lancer Regiment, a cavalry unit predominantly composed of Ukrainian soldiers from the eastern provinces, many of whom were conscripts from rural backgrounds similar to the Hutsul villagers he had visited years earlier. This posting was no coincidence. His family's Habsburg connections likely influenced the assignment, aligning with their strategy to use him as a liaison to Ukrainian subjects. But for Wilhelm, it became a crucible that accelerated his personal transformation from a curious aristocrat to a fervent advocate. Immersed in the regiment's daily realities, endless marches through muddy fields, the thunder of artillery, and the camaraderie of shared hardships, Wilhelm's affinity for Ukraine deepened exponentially. He voraciously read Ukrainian literature during rare moments of respite in the trenches, devouring Taras Shevchenko's poetry that sang of freedom and suffering under oppression, evoking images of serfs rising against tyrants and resonating with Wilhelm's own sense of constrained privilege. Ivan Franko's novels, rich with depictions of social injustice and the plight of the working classes in Galicia, mirrored the inequalities he witnessed among his troops, while Mikhailo Hrushevsky's groundbreaking histories, affirmed Ukraine's distinct identity as a separate nation with ancient roots, challenging the Russian and Polish narratives that dismissed it as a mere regional variant. These works fueled his conviction that Ukrainians deserved self-determination, not as subjects of a multi-ethnic empire, but as architects of their own destiny, echoing his internal rebellion against the imperial constraints that had defined his upbringing. The literature became more than intellectual pursuit. It was an emotional anchor, helping him process the war's horrors, the sight of fallen comrades, the stench of gunpowder, and the constant threat of death, while solidifying his identity as a bridge between his royal heritage and the people's cause. His soldiers, many of whom were simple farmers turned fighters, sensed his authentic respect in a world where officers often treated them with disdain, and this forged unbreakable bonds. In a gesture of profound trust, they gifted him a traditional vyshyvanka, an intricately embroidered shirt woven with symbolic patterns of protection and heritage, which he proudly wore beneath his uniform as a secret symbol of solidarity, a tactile reminder of his commitment amid the chaos of battle. They bestowed upon him the nickname Vasyl Vyshyvanyi, meaning Vasyl the Embroidered, a playful yet affectionate moniker that captured his adoption of their customs, and he embraced it fully, insisting that his men call him Vasyl in private moments, shedding the formality of his archducal title to foster a sense of equality in the hierarchical military structure. Wilhelm actively protected Galician Ukrainians from the paranoia of Polish authorities, who viewed them as potential spies or revolutionaries, intervening personally to prevent arrests and discrimination based on unfounded suspicions of disloyalty, often writing letters to superiors or confronting local commanders to ensure fair treatment. Such actions risked his own standing, as they challenged the empire's ethnic pecking order, but they earned him unwavering loyalty from his troops, who saw in him not just a leader, but a defender of their dignity. By 1916, at the remarkably young age of 21, Wilhelm's growing influence propelled him into Austria's parliament as a deputy in the upper house, where he navigated the ornate halls of Vienna's legislative chambers, forging alliances with prominent Ukrainian leaders like Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, a towering figure in the Greek Catholic Church whose spiritual guidance and political savvy made him a pillar of Ukrainian resistance. As a trusted liaison to Emperor Charles I, who had ascended the throne that year amid the war's escalating toll, Wilhelm advocated tirelessly for reforms, pushing for greater autonomy and cultural rights for Ukrainians within the empire's framework. He dreamed boldly of an autonomous Grand Duchy of Ukraine, a semi-independent state under Habsburg protection that would encompass eastern Galicia with its bustling city of Lviv, the mountainous Bukovina, and even territories wrested from the crumbling Russian Empire, envisioning a realm where Ukrainian language, education, and governance could flourish. While some contemporaries viewed him as a potential leader, whispering of his ambitions for a throne, Wilhelm positioned this vision not as raw personal ambition, but as a genuine belief in Ukraine's right to self-rule, repeatedly stating in private correspondences and meetings that he would accept such a role only if willed by the people themselves, reflecting his democratic leanings unusual for a Habsburg prince. As the war intensified with brutal offensives and staggering casualties, Wilhelm's unit was redeployed to battle Bolshevik forces in southern Ukraine, a theater where ideological clashes added layers of complexity to the fighting. Promoted to captain for his demonstrated valor and leadership, he took command of the battle group Archduke Wilhelm, a formidable force of about 4,000 Ukrainian troops, stationed near the historic Zaporozhian Sich, the legendary stronghold of Cossack independence that evoked romantic images of free warriors defending their lands against invaders. Wilhelm proved to be more than a conventional commander. He emerged as a guardian of local interests, blending military strategy with humanitarian concern in ways that set him apart from his peers. He boldly blocked Austrian and German forces from requisitioning peasants' grain, arguing that such actions would alienate the very people the empire needed as allies, and permitted locals to retain lands they had seized during the tumultuous 1917 revolutions, recognizing the justice in their claims amid the social upheavals. He meticulously vetted officials for loyalty to Ukrainian causes, weeding out those with Polish or German biases, and made a point of visiting ancient Cossack ruins, where he would gather his men around campfires to share stories of past glories, fostering a sense of historical continuity and inspiring them to fight not just for the empire, but for their heritage. Peasants in the region revered him, dubbing him Kniaz Vasyl, or Prince Vasyl, a title that blended royal deference with familial warmth, and his troops adopted blue and yellow armbands, early emblems of Ukrainian nationalism that fluttered like banners of hope amid the devastation. Yet intrigue shadowed his efforts, casting a veil of suspicion over his successes. In 1918, as the Central Powers' grip weakened, a coup installed Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky in Kiev under heavy German influence, creating a puppet regime that prioritized stability over genuine reform. Fears arose among German officials that Wilhelm, with his popular support and Ukrainian sympathies, might orchestrate a counter-coup to seize power. Officers in his Zaporizhzhia division, led by the charismatic Colonel Petro Bolbochan, actively plotted to crown him as a leader, seeing in him a figure who could unite disparate factions. Wilhelm, ever cautious, consulted Emperor Charles I directly, who vetoed the idea to preserve fragile alliances with Germany, prioritizing diplomatic expediency over nationalist dreams. Nonetheless, Wilhelm's influence proved pivotal in subtler ways. His behind-the-scenes maneuvering facilitated the deployment of Ukrainian regiments to Lviv, ensuring they remained loyal and paving the way for the proclamation of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic in November 1918, a fleeting but symbolically powerful assertion of independence. With the Austro-Hungarian Empire's total collapse following the armistice, Wilhelm fled southward to Bukovina, a multi-ethnic borderland where exhaustion and exposure led to his hospitalization with tuberculosis in Czernowitz, now Chernivtsi. This period laid bare his vulnerabilities, the physical illness, contracted from the war's unsanitary conditions and relentless stress, compounded by the emotional toll of witnessing his adopted nation's fragmentation as Ukraine splintered into warring factions amid foreign interventions. A deeper analysis of this phase reveals Wilhelm's military service as a microcosm of the war's nationalist undercurrents, where the conflict's chaos allowed suppressed identities to surface. His actions challenged the empire's rigid hierarchical structure, promoting equality and cultural pride among soldiers who had long suppressed their Ukrainian roots under fear of reprisal, transforming a mere regiment into a nucleus of national awakening. Yet this idealism inevitably clashed with geopolitical realities. The vetoed coup and forced retreat, highlighting how personal convictions were often subordinated to alliances and power plays. Through it all, Wilhelm's journey in the war illustrated the profound psychological depth of conviction, where empathy for the oppressed drove him forward even as the human cost mounted, leaving lasting scars on body and spirit. Ukrainian independence struggles and exile, 1918 to 1920. The end of World War I brought no peace for Wilhelm, as Ukraine descended into a chaotic war of independence against Bolsheviks, Poles, and others, a brutal multi-front struggle that turned the region into a blood-soaked battleground where alliances shifted like sand and civilian suffering reached unimaginable depths. The armistice signed in November 1918 may have silenced the guns on the Western Front, but in Eastern Europe, it unleashed a Pandora's box of revolutionary fervor, territorial grabs, and ideological clashes. With Ukraine caught in the vice of competing powers, the Red Army advancing from the east with communist zeal, Polish forces pushing from the west to reclaim historic lands, and scattered white Russian remnants adding to the anarchy. Wilhelm, having withdrawn from southern Ukraine with his battle group as the Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated into a mosaic of successor states, found himself adrift in this maelstrom, his Habsburg title now a liability rather than a shield. Fleeing the collapsing empire's remnants, he sought refuge in the rugged Carpathian Mountains, hiding for 6 grueling months in remote monasteries that dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels, their stone walls offering scant protection from the biting cold and constant fear of discovery. These Orthodox and Greek Catholic cloisters, perched on misty peaks and surrounded by dense forests, became his temporary sanctuaries, where monks provided meager sustenance, bread, cheese, and herbal teas, while sharing whispered tales of local folklore that further deepened his bond with Ukrainian spirituality. Evading Romanian forces who had swiftly occupied Bukovina as part of their expansionist claims, Wilhelm moved stealthily under cover of night, relying on sympathetic locals and his knowledge of the terrain from earlier travels, his once pristine uniform now tattered and his health waning from the tuberculosis that had first struck during the war. Captured in June 1919 while attempting to cross the treacherous mountain passes toward Ukrainian-held territory, Wilhelm was detained by Romanian troops in a makeshift prison camp, enduring 3 months of harsh confinement marked by interrogations, sparse rations, and the psychological strain of uncertainty. The Romanians, viewing him as a potential Habsburg agitator and a threat to their control over Bukovina's mixed population, subjected him to isolation and repeated questioning about his loyalties. But Wilhelm maintained a dignified composure, drawing on his aristocratic training to negotiate subtly for better treatment. His release came not through force but through persistent petitions from the Ukrainian People's Republic, whose diplomats in Paris and local representatives argued that Wilhelm's expertise and influence could bolster their fragile government against encroaching enemies. Freed at last, he made his way to Kamianets-Podilsky, a historic fortress town that served as the UNR's temporary capital amid the shifting front lines, its medieval walls a stark reminder of Ukraine's long history of defensive struggles. There, in a solemn ceremony amid the ruins of war-torn buildings, Wilhelm swore allegiance to the UNR, formally renouncing any lingering ties to the defunct Habsburg monarchy, and embracing Ukrainian citizenship with a fervor that surprised even his closest aides. Appointed as a colonel in the Ukrainian army, he was tasked with heading the international relations section of the General Staff, a role that leveraged his diplomatic skills honed from years of parliamentary work and royal connections. From makeshift offices cluttered with maps and telegrams, Wilhelm dispatched urgent appeals to Western powers, France, Britain, and the United States, seeking military aid, recognition, and financial support, crafting eloquent letters that highlighted Ukraine's strategic importance as a buffer against Bolshevism and invoking his personal transformation as proof of the cause's legitimacy. His multilingual abilities allowed him to correspond directly with foreign envoys, translating complex negotiations and building tentative alliances, though the responses were often tepid, hampered by the Allies' exhaustion from the war and their preference for a unified Russia over fragmented states. Betrayal soon followed, shattering the fragile optimism Wilhelm had clung to amid the chaos. In 1920, as the UNR's position grew increasingly desperate with Bolshevik advances and Polish encroachments, Simon Petlura, the Republic's leader, signed a controversial peace treaty with Poland, ceding vast Ukrainian territories in exchange for military assistance against the Reds, a pragmatic but, in Wilhelm's eyes, unforgivable compromise that sacrificed eastern Galicia and other regions to Polish control. This move, formalized in the Treaty of Warsaw, represented a profound betrayal of national interests, prioritizing short-term survival over the long-term unity and integrity of Ukrainian lands, and it struck Wilhelm like a personal affront, echoing the imperial manipulations he had rejected years earlier. Outraged, he resigned his commission immediately, penning a scathing letter to Petlura that condemned the agreement as a sellout of the people's sacrifices, his words laced with the passion of someone who had risked everything for the dream of an undivided Ukraine. This decision isolated him further from the UNR's leadership, branding him as an idealist unwilling to bend to realpolitik, and it marked the end of his direct military involvement in the independence struggle. Exiled once more, Wilhelm returned to Vienna, the once glorious imperial capital, now a humbled city in the nascent Austrian Republic, where he lived as a stateless figure, refusing to renounce his Habsburg claims despite the practical advantages of gaining citizenship. This stubborn adherence to his lineage, rooted in a mix of pride and lingering hope for a monarchist revival, left him in legal limbo, relying on family allowances and occasional support from Ukrainian émigré circles, his days filled with fruitless plotting and reflective solitude in modest apartments overlooking the Danube. This period deepened his isolation, as he witnessed from afar Ukraine's tragic partition between Poland, which annexed the western regions with brutal Polonization policies, and the Soviet Union, which imposed collectivization and repression in the East, erasing the independent state that had briefly flickered into existence despite the immense sacrifices of its people. Soldiers dying in forgotten battles, civilians enduring famines and pogroms, and intellectuals silenced by purges. A deeper analysis reveals this era as a pivotal turning point in Wilhelm's psyche, where the raw idealism of his wartime years began to fracture under the weight of repeated disappointments, transforming him from an optimistic bridge builder to a more cynical yet still principled figure. His resignation was not merely a political maneuver, but a profound moral stand, reflecting unwavering principles amid the widespread opportunism that characterized the Ukrainian leadership's desperate alliances. Petlura's treaty, for instance, mirrored the compromises Wilhelm had seen in Habsburg diplomacy, but now it hit closer to home, betraying the very peasants and soldiers he had championed. This act of defiance underscored his ethical core, prioritizing integrity over expediency, even at the cost of influence, and it highlighted the internal conflict between his aristocratic sense of honor and the gritty realities of revolutionary politics. Emotionally, the weight of exile bore down heavily, separating him physically and spiritually from the land and people he loved. The Carpathian villages where he had first awakened to Ukrainian culture now under foreign rule. The troops who had called him Vasyl scattered or perished, and the dream of a grand duchy reduced to ashes. This separation eroded his optimism gradually, like water wearing away stone, fostering a growing disillusionment that manifested in bouts of melancholy and introspective writing, where he grappled with the futility of individual agency against historical tides. The psychological toll was immense. Tuberculosis flare-ups, exacerbated by stress, sleepless nights haunted by memories of lost comrades, and a sense of personal failure despite his efforts, all contributing to a shift in worldview that would make him more susceptible to the radical ideologies of the interwar years. Yet this turning point also tempered his resolve, forging a resilience that would later fuel his resistance activities, as the pain of betrayal taught him the value of selective alliances and the enduring power of cultural identity in the face of erasure. In essence, this post-war chapter encapsulated the contradictions of Wilhelm's life, a Habsburg prince turned Ukrainian patriot, whose moral compass guided him through chaos but left him increasingly alone, setting the stage for the complex ideological navigations of the 1920s and 1930s, where desperation would tempt him toward unexpected paths while his core empathy remained intact. Interwar period. Political activism and personal challenges, 1920 to 1939. The interwar years were a crucible for Wilhelm's resolve, blending relentless activism with waves of personal turmoil that tested the very foundations of his identity and convictions. As Europe itself grappled with the aftermath of war, economic collapse, and the rise of extremist ideologies. In January 1921, shortly after settling into his Vienna exile, he made a bold public condemnation of the Polish massacres of Jews in Lwów, now Lviv, during the chaotic pogroms that followed the Polish-Ukrainian War, labeling Poland as dishonorable and accusing its forces of barbaric acts that betrayed the ideals of civilization. This outspoken stance, published in émigré newspapers and echoed in Ukrainian circles, not only highlighted his growing commitment to human rights and anti-Semitism, but also irrevocably estranged him from his father, Archduke Karl Stefan, whose Polish sympathies ran deep and who saw Wilhelm's words as a familial betrayal, leading to a complete rupture in their relationship that left Wilhelm emotionally adrift without paternal support or inheritance prospects. Undeterred, Wilhelm channeled his energies into founding the Ukrainian Free Cossack Society in Vienna, a veterans group that served as a hub for displaced Ukrainian soldiers and intellectuals, where they plotted with lingering monarchists to revive dreams of Ukrainian independence through clandestine meetings in dimly lit cafes and safe houses discussing strategies to undermine Polish and Soviet control over divided Ukrainian lands. To amplify their voice, he launched and edited the weekly newspaper Soborna Ukraina, meaning United Ukraine, which promoted national unity, cultural revival, and resistance against partition, featuring articles on history, folklore, and calls for international solidarity. Though its circulation remained limited due to financial constraints and censorship in the fragile Austrian Republic. Amid these efforts, Wilhelm's creative side emerged as a poignant outlet for his inner turmoil, culminating in his 1921 poetry collection, Meine Dni, or The Days Pass, written entirely in Ukrainian and dedicated to the fighters for freedom who had fallen in the independence wars, a testament to his linguistic immersion and emotional investment in the cause. The verses captured the melancholy of exile and the fleeting nature of human struggles, with one particularly evocative poem lamenting the passage of time and lost homelands. Gone are the days of exuberant love, gone are the days of sorrow, gone are the days of grievous suffering, and our long and arduous struggle fades into the mist of forgotten echoes. These lines, drawn from rarely preserved manuscripts, revealed a sensitive soul grappling with loss, where the rhythm of Ukrainian folk poetry blended with Habsburg introspection, offering glimpses into his psychological state, a man haunted by the ghosts of unfulfilled promises and the weight of a nation's dashed hopes. Critics in émigré communities praise the work for its authenticity, noting how Wilhelm's aristocratic background lent a unique elegance to themes of peasant resilience, though sales were modest, reflecting the niche audience for Ukrainian literature in Western Europe at the time. Financial woes plagued him relentlessly, turning what could have been a period of focused advocacy into a scramble for survival that underscored the harsh realities of stateless existence. Lacking citizenship and formal income, Wilhelm resorted to creative expedients, using a blank passport forged under his adopted name, Vasyl Vyshyvanyi, to travel discreetly to Spain in 1922, where he hoped to secure financial and political aid from his cousin, King Alfonso XIII, leveraging family ties to pitch Ukraine's cause as a bulwark against Bolshevism. The journey involved risky border crossings and stays in modest inns, but his audiences with the Spanish court yielded nothing substantial, as Alfonso, preoccupied with domestic unrest, offered only polite sympathies without committing resources, leaving Wilhelm to return empty-handed and more disillusioned. For the next decade, he eked out a living through sporadic journalism and veteran networks. But by 1931, as Spain descended into Republican turmoil, he relocated to Paris, the vibrant hub of European exiles where Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish communities intermingled in cafes like those on the left bank. There, he survived on modest family allowances, arranged after his father's death in 1933, when his brothers, including Karl Albrecht, who had inherited the Żywiecz estate, reluctantly paid off his accumulating debts, stemming from travel expenses and failed ventures, and provided a monthly stipend that barely covered rent and essentials, forcing Wilhelm into a frugal lifestyle far removed from his imperial youth. A devastating scandal erupted in 1934, further eroding his reputation and plunging him into deeper isolation. When his companion, Paulette Quiba, a French woman with a checkered past who had become his close associate in Paris's bohemian circles, forged a check for a substantial sum to defraud an investor in a dubious scheme promising Ukrainian investment opportunities. Wilhelm, implicated as her accomplice, though his exact role remains debated, some sources suggest he was unaware until too late, fled back to Vienna before the trial, evading French authorities and leaving behind a trail of sensational headlines in Parisian tabloids that portrayed him as a fallen prince entangled in fraud. Sentenced in absentia to 5 years in prison, the affair not only drained his remaining funds, but also amplified whispers about his private life, including rumored relationships with male assistants and secretaries, such as a young Ukrainian aide who accompanied him on travels, possibly exaggerated by intelligence agencies or political enemies to discredit his nationalist activities. These insinuations, drawn from contemporary gossip and later queer history analyses, revealed the intense societal pressures on his personal life in a conservative era, where non-conforming behaviors among aristocracy were scandalous, adding layers of vulnerability to a man already grappling with identity crises. Born Habsburg, adopted Ukrainian, and now labeled deviant. This period humanized Wilhelm profoundly, showing a figure not of unyielding strength but of fragile humanity, where desperation for funds to support his cause led to poor judgments, mirroring the broader economic despair of the Great Depression that pushed many into moral compromises. Politically, Wilhelm shifted dangerously during the 1930s, briefly sympathizing with Austrian and Italian fascists whose authoritarian structures appealed to his monarchist roots, before extending tentative feelers toward the Nazis, hoping that a new European war might shatter Soviet control and liberate Ukraine as a byproduct of German expansionism. He initially welcomed the 1938 Anschluss, Austria's annexation by Nazi Germany, viewing it through the lens of anti-communism as a potential catalyst for dismantling the USSR, even attending early rallies where swastika banners waved alongside promises of order. However, brutal Gestapo interrogation soon exposed the Nazis' utter indifference to Ukrainian independence, treating Slavic peoples as inferior, and Ukraine merely as Lebensraum for Aryan settlement, which disillusioned Wilhelm profoundly and turned him irrevocably against them, prompting quiet withdrawals from fascist circles and a reevaluation of his alliances. This flirtation, often overlooked in broader Habsburg narratives, stemmed from pragmatic anti-Bolshevism rather than ideological alignment. His hatred for Soviet repression of Ukrainian culture outweighed initial naivety about Hitler's intentions, but it tarnished his legacy, associating him with regimes that would later commit atrocities, a stain that historians debate as opportunistic survival versus misguided hope. This phase underscores Wilhelm's profound contradictions, a principled activist ensnared by desperation, where his unwavering dedication to Ukraine clashed with the compromises forced by exile and poverty. Analyzed in context, his fascist flirtations reveal a man shaped by the era's polarization, where the choice between communism and fascism seemed binary to many anti-Bolsheviks. Yet Wilhelm's pivot away from Nazism demonstrated an underlying moral compass that prioritized national self-determination over totalitarianism. Personal scandals, including the financial desperation that led to the forgery affair and the rumored homosexuality that fueled societal judgment, humanize him as a complex individual grappling with isolation in a judgmental world, far from the confident prince of his youth who had danced in Hutsul villages. These years and stripped away illusions, exposing the fragile beauty of his human experience. Empathy for the oppressed mingled with personal flaws, resilience tempered by pain, painting Wilhelm not as a flawless hero, but as a flawed visionary whose struggles mirrored the turbulent interwar Europe, where dreams of freedom often crumbled under the weight of reality. World War II, Resistance and Espionage, 1939 to 1945. World War II unveiled Wilhelm's resilient core, shifting from the disillusionment that had clouded his interwar years to a phase of active resistance marked by calculated risks and renewed purpose, as the conflict's global scale forced him to confront the true nature of the regimes he had once tentatively engaged with. Recognizing the Nazis' exploitative designs on Ukraine, where Hitler's forces treated the territory not as a potential ally for independence, but as a resource-rich colony for Aryan expansion, complete with plans for ethnic cleansing and forced labor that echoed the imperial oppressions Wilhelm had long opposed, he made a decisive break from any lingering sympathies. This realization came sharply after his arrest and interrogation by the Gestapo in the wake of the 1938 Anschluss, an experience that stripped away illusions and ignited what historian Timothy Snyder described as a pure hatred of Nazism, propelling him into Vienna's anti-Nazi underground, a shadowy network of dissidents operating in the heart of the Reich's annexed territories. Here, amid the city's war-torn streets and under the constant watch of informants, Wilhelm leveraged his aristocratic connections and unassuming presence to infiltrate circles where German officers let slip valuable details, transforming from a peripheral figure into a committed resistor who saw the fight against fascism as an extension of his lifelong Ukrainian advocacy. From early 1942, as the war's tide began to turn with Allied advances and the Eastern Front's brutal stalemates, Wilhelm embarked on espionage activities that aligned him firmly with the Allies, initially working for the British Secret Intelligence Service, or SIS, whose agents valued his insider access to Austrian military and industrial secrets. His tasks involved subtle information gathering, such as monitoring troop deployments and factory outputs in Vienna's aviation sector, where he could pose as a neutral observer without arousing immediate suspicion. Transitioning later to collaboration with the French resistance, a decentralized movement of partisans and intelligence operatives fighting occupation across Europe, Wilhelm expanded his scope to include not only Nazi military movements, tracking convoys, supply lines, and fortification plans that could aid Allied bombings, but also emerging Soviet activities as the Red Army pushed westward, foreshadowing the Cold War tensions that would define the post-war era. This dual focus reflected his prescient understanding of the shifting geopolitical landscape, where the defeat of one totalitarian power might simply pave the way for another's dominance over Ukraine, compelling him to collect data on Soviet troop concentrations and political maneuvers in occupied zones, information that proved invaluable to Western strategists planning for the continent's future. Collaborating closely with Paul Masse, a French national forcibly deported to Vienna and compelled to labor in a military aviation factory under Nazi oversight, Wilhelm bridged the gap between Ukrainian nationalists and Western intelligence agencies, creating a conduit for sensitive operations that blended anti-Nazi sabotage with long-term anti-Soviet planning. Masse, with his own ties to French and possibly British networks, became a key partner in passing aircraft blueprints and production schedules to Allied handlers, and Wilhelm joined this clandestine effort, using his social standing to facilitate meetings and secure documents without direct exposure. This partnership extended to Ukrainian groups, particularly the Bandera faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUNB, a militant wing known for its fierce independence drive and controversial tactics against both Nazis and Soviets. Wilhelm dispatched his trusted aide, Roman Novosad, a young Ukrainian music student in Vienna who doubled as a courier, to establish contacts with figures like Mykola Lebed, a prominent OUN leader operating from displaced persons, camps in the chaotic aftermath of liberation, where thousands of refugees huddled in makeshift barracks awaiting uncertain fates. Through Novosad's missions, often involving perilous train journeys across war-ravaged Europe, Wilhelm facilitated the flow of arms, funds, and propaganda materials to Ukraine's underground resistance, including the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or UPA, which waged guerrilla warfare against occupying forces in the forests and mountains of western Ukraine. His multilingual skills, fluent in Ukrainian for nuanced communications with nationalists, Polish for navigating border regions, French for liaising with resistance operatives, German for blending into Viennese society, and Russian for decoding Soviet intercepts, made him an invaluable asset, allowing him to translate coded messages, forge documents, and interpret intercepted radio transmissions with precision that eluded monolingual agents. Yet the risks were immense, a constant undercurrent of danger that shadowed every action. Narrow escapes from assassination attempts orchestrated by Gestapo, hit squads who suspected his double life, relentless surveillance by informants embedded in émigré communities, and the ever-present threat of betrayal in a world where loyalties fractured under torture or temptation. A deeper analysis here reveals Wilhelm's remarkable evolution from the naive idealist of his youth, who had once flirted with fascist promises in a desperate bid for Ukrainian freedom, to a seasoned operative whose espionage embodied a profound moral pivot, redeeming those earlier missteps by confronting totalitarianism head-on with unflinching resolve. This transformation was not abrupt, but forged in the fires of personal disillusionment and wartime necessity, where the Gestapo's harsh interrogation served as a catalyst, stripping away ideological blinders and reigniting his core empathy for the oppressed. His actions during this period highlighted an extraordinary courage, as he risked not just his life but the remnants of his family's legacy, imprisonment, execution, or posthumous disgrace, for a cause that had defined him since his teenage awakenings in the Carpathians, a commitment that spoke to the psychological depth of a man who found renewed purpose in the shadows of espionage, operating in the moral gray zones of resistance, where alliances with controversial groups like the OUNB required navigating ethical ambiguities. Wilhelm's work underscored a resilient humanism, a prince turned spy who channeled isolation and past pains into acts of defiance, embodying the fragile beauty of conviction amid humanity's darkest hours, where individual agency could still flicker against overwhelming odds. Arrest, imprisonment, and death, 1947 to 1948. In August 1947, Wilhelm's fate was sealed during a raucous birthday party for the Ukrainian poet Vasyl Kacharovsky in Vienna, an event that unfolded in one of the city's modest apartments, where émigré artists and intellectuals gathered to celebrate with songs, toasts, and spirited discussions of literature and lost homelands, unwittingly drawing the sharp scrutiny of Soviet agents who had infiltrated the city's post-war chaos. The party, filled with the sounds of laughter and traditional Ukrainian melodies, represented a brief escape from the tensions of the emerging Cold War, but it quickly turned ominous when authorities raided the gathering, arresting Kacharovsky on suspicions of anti-Soviet activities tied to his poetry that subtly critiqued Stalinist oppression. This arrest rippled outward, implicating Wilhelm and his close aide Roman Novosad through their associations in the Ukrainian exile community, where shared networks of resistance often blurred lines between cultural events and clandestine plotting. SMERSH, the fearsome Soviet counterintelligence agency known for its ruthless efficiency in hunting down perceived enemies of the state, ranging from spies to dissidents, swiftly seized Wilhelm, dragging him from the shadows of Vienna's divided zones into a web of interrogation and accusation that would mark the beginning of his end. Interrogated in the austere facilities of Baden-Baden, a spa town turned temporary holding site just outside Vienna, Wilhelm faced a barrage of questions from Soviet officers, determined to extract confessions of espionage and treason. Their methods, blending psychological pressure with threats of violence in dimly lit rooms that echoed with the clatter of typewriters recording every word, in a striking act of defiance that encapsulated his lifelong commitment to Ukrainian identity. He demanded to testify in Ukrainian rather than Russian or German, asserting his cultural and national allegiance one last time in a language that symbolized his adopted heritage, even as translators scrambled to accommodate him, a move that frustrated his captors but underscored his unbowed spirit amid overwhelming odds. This insistence was more than procedural. It was a final proclamation of self, a refusal to be reduced to a mere Habsburg relic or Soviet prisoner, but a man who had chosen Ukraine as his true home. Transferred in November 1947 to Kiev's notorious Lukyanivka prison, a grim fortress-like structure in the heart of the Ukrainian capital where political dissidents were routinely broken through isolation and deprivation, Wilhelm confronted a litany of fabricated charges that painted him as a lifelong enemy of the Soviet regime, espionage on behalf of Western powers, orchestrating Habsburg aggression against the Soviets during World War I, loyal service under Simon Petlura's short-lived Ukrainian government, and ongoing intelligence work for Britain and France that allegedly continued his anti-communist activities into the post-war era. Sentenced to 25 years of hard labor in July 1948 by the MGB's Special Council, an extrajudicial body operating outside any semblance of legal due process, and notorious for its rubber-stamp verdicts that condemned thousands without trial or appeal, Wilhelm's health deteriorated rapidly from the tuberculosis that had plagued him since his World War I days, exacerbated by the prison's brutal conditions. Overcrowded cells with minimal ventilation, meager rations of watery soup and stale bread, and exposure to damp cold that accelerated respiratory infections among inmates. The disease, which had once been manageable in freer times, now ravaged his body unchecked, with coughing fits that left him weakened and isolated from even the sparse camaraderie of fellow prisoners, many of whom were Ukrainian nationalists facing similar fates. Hospitalized on July 1, 1948, in the prison's rudimentary medical ward, a place more akin to a holding area for the dying than a facility for care, with basic cots and indifferent guards overseeing the decline. Wilhelm succumbed alone on August 18th at the age of 53, his final moments unmarked by family or friends, just the sterile silence of institutional indifference. Buried in an unmarked grave, likely in the prison yard, where anonymous plots concealed countless victims, or the nearby Lukyanivka cemetery, a sprawling site of forgotten souls on Kiev's outskirts, his remains vanished into obscurity, denying even the dignity of a memorial. The Soviets meticulously concealed his death, falsifying records and stonewalling inquiries from Austrian officials and family, ensuring that rumors of his survival lingered for years to sow confusion and fear. Adding insult to erasure, Austria posthumously revoked his citizenship in 1952, deeming his pre-war passport invalid under the new republic's laws, effectively stripping him of any legal existence and reducing a life of passion and sacrifice to bureaucratic nullity. This tragic end, analyzed deeply, symbolizes the unyielding brutality of Soviet repression, a system that crushed not just bodies, but entire narratives of resistance, methodically erasing figures like Wilhelm, who embodied threats to its monolithic control through their advocacy for national self-determination. His final defiance in demanding Ukrainian testimony during interrogations reflects an unyielding pride, a psychological anchor that preserved his sense of self amid dehumanizing circumstances, turning a moment of vulnerability into a quiet victory of cultural assertion against linguistic and ideological domination. Meanwhile, his isolated death evokes the profound loneliness inherent in a life devoted to a distant dream, where the prince who had forsaken palaces for peasants' causes ended in utter solitude, his sacrifices swallowed by the regime he opposed, leaving behind a legacy of quiet heroism that would only resurface decades later in the thawing of perestroika, reminding us of the human cost when personal conviction collides with totalitarian might. The human side, personal stories and emotional impact. Wilhelm was no aloof royal but a man of flesh and contradictions, haunted by quiet pains and fleeting joys that wove through his existence like threads in one of the embroidered shirts he cherished so deeply, revealing a complexity far beyond the historical figure often reduced to mere titles and dates. As a teenager, he escaped the confines of his family's Polish-centric world, where conversations at the dinner table revolved around restoring a Polish kingdom and dismissing Ukrainians as lesser subjects, by embarking on secretive journeys into the Carpathian Mountains, slipping away under assumed names to avoid scandal or interference. There, in humble Hutsul huts, made of rough-hewn logs and thatched roofs, he slept on simple straw mattresses, waking to the sounds of roosters and the scent of wood smoke, immersing himself in a way of life that contrasted sharply with the opulent estates of his upbringing. He learned folk songs that stirred his soul, melodies passed down through generations about love lost in the mountains, heroic Cossacks defying invaders, and the enduring spirit of a people bound to their land, songs that he would hum quietly during moments of solitude, forging an emotional bond with Ukraine's spirit that transcended mere curiosity and became a profound, almost visceral attachment, as if the rhythms of those tunes echoed the heartbeat of a nation he had chosen to embrace. In the trenches of World War I, amid the mud and misery of Galicia's front lines, Wilhelm shared bread with soldiers who huddled in fear, breaking off pieces from his own rations to pass around during rare lulls in the fighting, creating moments of camaraderie that humanized the horrors around them. These men, many from Ukrainian villages like those he had visited, were fearful of revealing their roots, knowing that any display of national pride could brand them as political suspects in an empire rife with ethnic suspicions. But Wilhelm admonished them gently yet firmly, drawing from his own experiences to encourage self-respect. In his memoirs, he recounted the scene vividly. My regiment was composed of Ukrainians who all had a strong national identity, but were afraid to reveal it. Because every Ukrainian was considered a political suspect, I admonished them for this and told them that if I acknowledged the Ukrainian nation, they should also. The fighters in my Satya have high moral values and are fantastic fighters. I truly believe that Ukrainians make the best soldiers. These words, spoken in the dim light of dugouts, with the distant rumble of artillery as backdrop, not only boosted morale, but also reflected his deep conviction in the inherent strength and dignity of the Ukrainian people, turning a prince into a mentor who led by example rather than decree. Eyewitness accounts from those turbulent years recall his remarkably simple life among the troops, far removed from the pomp of Habsburg courts, where he ate from shared plates during communal meals in makeshift camps, scooping up stew with the same spoons as his men, laughing at their jokes and sharing stories that bridged class divides. A particularly poignant anecdote from Zaporizhzhia in 1918 captures this warmth. On Trinity Day, a sacred holiday marked by green decorations and prayers for renewal, a village elder approached him with the traditional offering of bread and salt, symbols of hospitality and blessing. Wilhelm responded in fluent Ukrainian, reciting a local proverb about unity in hardship, which elicited joyful cries from the gathered crowd, tears in some eyes as they hailed him as Kniaz Vasyl, cementing his place in the locals' hearts as a protector who understood their world from the inside. His poetry, penned during the lonely nights of exile, echoed the profound loneliness of displacement, with verses that blended romantic longing with calls to action, such as in one stirring piece, to arms, my riflemen, to save your native land, stand tall and strong like loyal Cossack sons, and return home as heroes." These lines, scribbled in notebooks smudged with ink and travel dust, captured the ache of separation from the land he loved, a creative outlet that humanized his struggles and preserved fragments of his inner world for posterity. Yet shadows loomed persistently over his life, casting long doubts and pains that contrasted these moments of connection. Tuberculosis contracted from the damp trenches and wartime hardships, which flared up repeatedly, leaving him weakened and coughing blood during stressful periods, a constant reminder of mortality. Family estrangement followed his anti-Polish stances, particularly after his public condemnations of massacres, severing ties with his father and siblings, who viewed his Ukrainian sympathies as treasonous to their heritage, isolating him emotionally in a web of unspoken regrets. The humiliation of the Paris fraud scandal in the 1930s added public shame, with newspaper headlines branding him a swindler entangled in forgery, eroding his reputation and forcing him into defensive silence. Rumors of his private life, including close ties with male secretaries who accompanied him on travels and discreet visits to brothels in European cities, hinted at deeper isolation in a judgmental era where such matters were taboo, possibly fueling self-doubt and loneliness amid societal whispers that painted him as deviant, though these may have been exaggerated by enemies seeking to undermine his activism. A contemporary observer, perhaps one of his aides or a fellow exile, noted insightfully, constantly surrounded by Ukrainians, his acute Austrian mind caught all their virtues and flaws, a remark that highlighted his perceptive nature, blending admiration with critical awareness as he navigated the complexities of human relationships in pursuit of a greater cause. Wilhelm's story evokes life's fragility in its rawest form, a prince who forsook the gilded halls of palaces for the muddy fields of battle and exile, driven by an unshakable empathy for the overlooked and oppressed, revealing the emotional cost of such conviction, the quiet toll of sacrificed comforts, broken bonds, and unspoken sorrows that accompanied his extraordinary path, making him a figure not of distant legend, but of deeply relatable humanity. Controversies and historical debates. Controversies enveloped Wilhelm like the elusive Carpathian mists that had once shrouded his youthful adventures, adding intricate layers to his legacy that continue to spark debate among scholars and enthusiasts alike, forcing us to confront the multifaceted nature of a man who straddled worlds of privilege and rebellion. At the heart of these discussions lies a fundamental question. Was he an ambitious throne seeker, cunningly maneuvering for power, or a selfless patriot driven purely by altruism? Some historians, drawing from archival documents and contemporary correspondences, argue that he leveraged the immense prestige of his Habsburg lineage for personal gain, aggressively eyeing Ukraine's potential crown as a means to elevate his own status within the crumbling imperial framework, pointing to his role in the proposed Grand Duchy as evidence of calculated self-interest that aligned conveniently with family strategies of ethnic patronage. Others counter this view with equal vigor, insisting that Wilhelm consistently demurred from overt grabs for authority, emphasizing in his writings and statements that true leadership must stem from the popular will of the people, not imposed from above, as seen in his reluctance to pursue the 1918 coup despite strong support from his troops, portraying him instead as a reluctant figurehead whose actions were motivated by genuine empathy for Ukrainian self-determination rather than ego or dynastic ambition. His interwar fascist sympathies raise even thornier questions, complicating the narrative of his political evolution and prompting scrutiny of how desperation can lead principled individuals astray in turbulent times. He briefly expressed support for Austrian and Italian fascists, drawn to their anti-communist rhetoric and promises of order amid economic chaos, before extending a tentative welcome to the 1938 Anschluss, Hitler's annexation of Austria, in the naive hope that Nazi aggression might fracture the Soviet Union's hold on Ukraine, creating an opportunity for independence amid the ensuing upheaval. Yet this phase was short-lived. He swiftly pivoted to outright resistance upon realizing the Nazis' profound disdain for Ukrainian independence, viewing Slavs as inferior and Ukraine merely as territory for exploitation, a revelation that came through brutal Gestapo interrogations and first-hand observations of their policies, transforming his initial misjudgment into a catalyst for deeper opposition and highlighting the fluidity of alliances in an era dominated by ideological extremes. The 1935 Paris fraud trial further muddies his image, casting a shadow of scandal that tainted his public persona and exposed vulnerabilities in his private dealings during the exile. Entangled in the scheme, orchestrated by his companion Paulette Quiba, who forged a check to defraud a French investor under the guise of funding Ukrainian causes, Wilhelm's involvement, whether active or unwitting, led to his frantic flight back to Vienna before the proceedings, resulting in a 5-year prison sentence handed down in absentia that branded him a fugitive in the eyes of French law and sensationalized headlines across Europe. This episode not only sullied his reputation, portraying him as a desperate opportunist willing to bend ethics for survival, but also amplified whispers about his personal life, including suggestions of homosexuality drawn from queer history accounts and contemporary gossip that detailed close emotional ties with male secretaries and aides who shared his travels and confidences. These rumors, possibly amplified by political enemies seeking to discredit his nationalist efforts, suggest underlying personal struggles in a rigidly judgmental era where societal biases against nonconforming behaviors expose the Red Prince to ridicule and isolation. His defiance of norms in embracing Ukraine's underclass, mirrored in the private battles he may have fought against conventional expectations of masculinity and royalty. His espionage role during World War II sparks ongoing debates about heroism versus opportunism, adding nuance to assessments of his moral character amid the ambiguities of wartime alliances. By bridging Ukrainian nationalists from the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, particularly its Bandera faction known for controversial tactics including violent resistance and collaborations that bordered on the ethically fraught with Western intelligence agencies like the British SIS and French resistance, Wilhelm facilitated critical flows of information, arms, and funds, but this intermediary position complicates his standing, as critics question whether he was a true hero sacrificing for freedom, or an opportunist navigating shadows for personal redemption after earlier fascist flirtations. Even his death invites intense scrutiny, with official Soviet records claiming proper treatment during imprisonment, including allowances like a personal plate for meals to suggest humane conditions. Yet the reality of isolation in Lukyanivska prison, coupled with the rapid progression of his tuberculosis under neglectful care, points to subtler cruelties, psychological torment through solitary confinement, denial of medical aid, and the erasure of his identity that paint a picture of deliberate attrition rather than outright violence. These debates collectively illuminate Wilhelm's profound complexity, a radical born into Habsburg tradition, forever haunted by the old ties of blood and empire that both empowered and constrained him. His life a tapestry of bold choices interwoven with human frailties. History remains open and unsettled in his case, challenging rigid views of loyalty and identity that often demand black and white judgments, instead inviting a reevaluation of how personal flaws, ambition, ideological missteps, scandals, and private vulnerabilities intersect with grand historical causes, reminding us that figures like Wilhelm embody the messy reality of human endeavor, where greatness and imperfection coexist in the pursuit of ideals that transcend individual lifetimes. Consequences and historical significance. Wilhelm's life extended far beyond his mere 53 years, leaving an indelible mark on Ukraine's historical narrative through a legacy of advocacy that resonated across generations and shaped the nation's quest for identity and sovereignty. His tireless efforts fortified the early independence movements that emerged in the turbulent aftermath of World War I, providing both inspiration and practical support to formations like the Sich Riflemen, an elite Ukrainian volunteer unit whose fighters drew motivation from Wilhelm's example of cultural solidarity and military leadership, embodying the spirit of resistance against imperial domination. Similarly, his behind-the-scenes influence was instrumental in the establishment of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic in November 1918, where his strategic deployment of loyal regiments in Lviv helped tip the balance toward a brief but symbolically powerful declaration of autonomy, a moment that, though short-lived, planted the ideological foundations for future assertions of statehood amid the chaos of partition and foreign occupation. By championing the peasants and their culture in such tangible ways, immersing himself in the Ukrainian language to communicate directly with villagers, protecting local communities from wartime requisitions that could have devastated their livelihoods, and promoting national symbols like the blue and yellow armbands worn by his troops as emblems of unity and pride. He sowed the seeds of a resilient national consciousness that would bloom vibrantly in later anti-Soviet struggles, including the dissident movements of the 1960s and 1970s, where underground poets and activists invoked his story as a beacon of enduring hope against communist erasure, ensuring that the flame of cultural revival he had kindled continued to burn even under the harshest repressions. His transformation from an Austrian archduke to Vasyl Vyshyvanyi challenged and countered the persistent Russian narratives that portrayed Ukraine as an artificial entity, a mere invention of external forces without authentic roots, by demonstrating through his own life how Ukrainian identity could attract and integrate figures from Europe's elite, thereby validating its legitimacy on the international stage and inspiring later cultural revivals that emphasize shared European values like humanism and self-determination. This symbolic role extended beyond rhetoric, as his immersion in Ukrainian folklore, literature, and traditions, such as wearing the vyshyvanka and composing poetry in the language, helped preserve and elevate elements of national heritage that might otherwise have been marginalized, fostering a sense of continuity that proved vital during periods of enforced Russification under Soviet rule. Politically, his acts of resistance during World War II prefigured the intricate Cold War alliances that would form between Ukrainian émigrés scattered across the West and intelligence agencies seeking to undermine Soviet dominance, with Wilhelm's espionage activities directly aiding anti-Soviet efforts by funneling critical information and resources to underground networks that sustained partisan warfare in Ukraine's forests long after the war's end. His covert work, bridging nationalist groups like the OUN with British and French operatives, laid early groundwork for the diaspora-led campaigns that pressured Western governments during the Helsinki Accords and beyond, highlighting how individual defiance could ripple into broader geopolitical shifts. The turning point came with his 1989 rehabilitation during the era of perestroika, a policy of openness under Mikhail Gorbachev that signaled a tentative Soviet thaw and acknowledged the injustices of Stalinist purges, allowing Wilhelm's name to be cleared posthumously and restoring a measure of dignity to his memory amid the crumbling Iron Curtain. This was followed by the declassification of his case files in 1994, transferred to Ukrainian state archives where researchers could finally access interrogation transcripts and personal documents that illuminated his espionage and nationalist passions, and culminated in 2005 when these materials, including photographs and letters, were returned to his family, specifically his nephew Leo Habsburg Lothringen, sparking a renaissance of interest that manifested in cultural productions like operas dramatizing his life as a tragic opera of loyalty and loss, books exploring his psychological depths, and lively discussions on online forums and academic conferences that dissected his role in Ukraine's modern identity formation. Today, amid Ukraine's ongoing conflicts where the echoes of imperialism resurface in aggressive territorial claims and hybrid warfare, Vasyl Vyshyvanyi stands as a potent symbol of resilience, a figure whose embroidered shirt and defiant choices remind a beleaguered nation of its capacity to endure and reclaim agency against overwhelming odds. His story imparts timeless lessons on the potency of empathy in bridging societal divides, showing how a privileged outsider could cross cultural chasms to uplift the marginalized through genuine understanding and action, while also illustrating the personal toll of such conviction, the physical ailments, familial rifts, and ultimate isolation that accompanied his unyielding path. It serves as a stark warning against the savagery of totalitarianism, where regimes like the Soviets could erase lives and legacies with bureaucratic cruelty, urging vigilance in an era where authoritarian shadows loom once more. In this age of rising nationalism, where populist leaders often exploit divisions for power, Wilhelm reminds us that authentic leadership lies in humanizing others rather than dominating them, fostering connections that honor individual dignity and collective heritage, thereby urging the preservation of fragile freedoms that, once lost, demand generations to reclaim. Wilhelm's legacy is not carved in stone, but embroidered in memory. A prince without a throne, a fighter without a country, and a human heart that dared to belong where he was never expected to.